Hi, tonight on Alternative 2016, as part of our series of interviews with our Green Party presidential candidates, we have with us Bill Kreml, or as some of you may, if you're doing Google searches on him, William P. Kreml, who's authored some very interesting books on psychology and politics. A little bit about what this series is about. We're like any other political party. We have a number of candidates who are seeking our nomination, and they are in various stages, from having been announced to in the exploratory stage. Like any other political party, we have primaries, caucuses, and conventions. The Green Party now has ballot lines in 22 states and counting. There'll be more before the end of the year, and certainly throughout the petition period next year. Our presidential candidate is usually on the ballot for about 80 to 90% of the population, and well within the margins of being a potential electoral college winner. That, of course, is up to the voters. So it is important to dispel the notion that Greens can't win. Technically, legally, the Green Party can win. Whether they win is up to the voters, and the will to want something different and vote for it, rather than voting for corporate-sponsored political parties. Currently, most voters tend to make their decisions based on the amount of money spent on advertising, and to the extent that influences the paid news media, who tend to favor the higher-paying clients in their coverage, because that is what they believe gets them the most ratings. With that, I'll introduce Bill Kreml, and we'll have him talk to you a little bit about his background, what brought him into politics, and what brought him into the Green Party, how he got from where he began to where he is right now. And with that, this is Bill. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Craig. I appreciate what you're doing here. This is a wonderful service for the Green Party, and it's really good that you're speaking to all of the candidates. You asked me to say a word or two about my family background. I'm a Chicagoan, and my family goes back in public life at least 100 years. My great-grandfather was the president of the Chicago Grocers and Butchers Association back in the early part of the 20th century. My grandfather was one of Anton Cermak's aides. I know all of you have read about Cermak, who lived all too short a life as a reformer. He was shot sitting next to Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, but he was a wonderful mayor, and my grandfather was one of the people who helped him. My great uncle was the city auditor of the city of Chicago for 32 years. My father ran the Traffic Institute and then the Transportation Center at Northwestern University, was probably the top consultant on traffic and transportation and, one wing, the streets in the Chicago Loop, stuff like that, how do you keep the traffic flowing? I was born in 1941. In 6 days, I will be 74. I'm probably the oldest of the candidates. I remember politics going all the way back. I remember the tail end of World War II, my mother saving animal fat, things like that, the meat coupons that she took to the butcher, that kind of thing. The first riveting episode of politics that I recall, my parents bought a television set in Christmas of '47, which was early for TV, but they were public people and they wanted to watch things. And we watched the 1948 convention of the Democratic Party. I think there were two candidates, black and white. Somebody was up in the balcony, someone was on the floor, kind of thing. But you remember that was the convention that Hubert Humphrey gave that rather famous speech in favor of the civil rights plank. And the entire Mississippi delegation walked out. Half of the Alabama delegation walked out. And my father through the roof. I never saw him.
I should point out for those people who don't know, because their perception of what the Mississippi and Alabama delegation might have looked like back then. It's very different than what it would be today.
It had a little H on it, too.
Right.
But these guys, I think 35 or so of them, just plain stormed out of the building. And it was a very dramatic thing, but it was made more dramatic. I mean, I was just turning 7 years old, so I hardly had a sophisticated understanding. I knew that something significant happened by the fact that my father, was shaking his finger at the television. Traitors, these are the same people who seceded from the Union and blah, 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 blah. I mean, it was a very dramatic thing that I recall from my very early years. Well, getting on into education, my father was at Northwestern. I went to Northwestern as an undergraduate, Northwestern Law School. Graduated in 1965, which means that I am now celebrating my first half century as an academic. I haven't done a lot of teaching in the last years, but I taught a few courses, a few individual classes, I should say, at the College of Charleston in this past academic year. So I can honestly say that I was in the academy for a half century. Went on into Indiana University, got a PhD in political science there. Had some wonderful people. I won't name them all. I will name Eleanor Ostrom. Eleanor Ostrom was my philosophy of science professor at Indiana University and is still the only woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. An extraordinary person. She mentored me, and I just owe her very, very much. So in the academy, 50 years, most of it on the political science faculty at the University of South Carolina. I'm not going to say anything about the theory. I appreciate you mentioning it, and I appreciate you're mentioning books. I have a second edition of a book called The Bias of Temperament in American Politics. If anybody's interested, that's the updated and added on publication that people can get. You can get it through Amazon and so forth. So moving on into politics, what did I do politically? By the late 1970s, I was convinced that there was something rather serious going on with the American government. I decided to run for the Senate in the state of South Carolina, and of course I ran in the Democratic primary. My opponent was Fritz Hollings, who was, absolute. I wasn't going to beat Fritz Hollings, okay? But I was very fortunate. First of all, let me say I took some speech drills. I had a slight speech handicap as a kid. Wasn't terrible, but my father returned from the war. You know that syndrome. It's in the literature. And for a while as a child, I had a kind of a bad speech handicap. Took speech drills and said, I'm going to run for the Senate. And I took leave without pay in 1980. And fortunately, my campaign, because it began to talk about the structure of the government and talk about gridlock and talk about the national debt and talk about how the interest groups were really, really becoming very, very powerful. So that campaign was covered in the TRB column of the New Republic and Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, and I called for the use of the bicentennial in 1987 as a point in time in which some smart people could get together and make recommendations for constitutional and sub-constitutional change. And fortunately, that group was formed, the Committee on the Constitutional System, and we met in the mid 80s, and we handed our recommendations to the president and the Congress in 1987. One of the reasons I left the Democratic Party, apart from all of the policy reasons, was that the Democratic Party completely ignored this wonderful group of people. The chair was Lloyd Cutler, who had been counsel to the president under Jimmy Carter. C. Douglas Dillon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury, Undersecretary of State, Nancy Kassebaum, Bill Fulbright from Arkansas. I could go on and on. It was an A-list group of people. And to have the Democratic Party just ignore us was something that I've never wholly understood.
Oh, because I was going to let me ask you this. Although you said you never fully understood, that's actually to me the most challenging question, because I know people who've gone through activism within the Democratic Party and at some point felt they weren't being responded to when they were delivering a very reasonable recommendation. So I'll challenge you with this question. Do you think now you might have at least postulate why they may have ignored you? Why they may have ignored this group of people?
I think two things were happening. One is that the interest groups were so powerful that significant players within the Democratic Party really didn't want change. If it had happened 10 years earlier, maybe. But by that time, the interest groups really had their hooks into the Democratic Party, and they didn't want to change the game any more than the Republicans did, which greatly, greatly disappointed me. There's a second reason, too, and I don't want to spend a great deal of time, but I'm going to answer your question on it. To some extent, the political world was already going through a transformation in which politics, and particularly campaigns, were being taken over by the practitioners. It wasn't the smoke-filled rooms anymore. It was the pollsters, the video people, the handlers. And I wrote a piece for the largest newspaper in South Carolina. The practitioners are part of the problem. That the party officials and the campaign industry, as I grew to call it, had just kind of taken over the system. And so, it's kind of like the boiler room was running the ship, and of course they didn't want change either. This was a very lucrative and influential position that they had achieved, and they really didn't want to hear about changing things. Well, anyway, just to finish this strain, in 1984, took leave without pay again, did some more speech therapy, and went up to the New England states, upstate New York. There was a Harvard Law guy out in Montana who brought me out. So I campaigned in 8 states for president. Got a few votes here and there, but again, talked about how the system was really deteriorating.
This is still as a Democrat, right?
Yes,
So. Okay.
Still as a Democrat, yes. And as I say, in 87, we gave our recommendation to the president and the Congress. Nobody paid any attention. 92, I did a similar thing. This in the kind of middle Atlantic states, starting with Haverford College on down through the Thomas Jefferson Society at UVA. I was on the ballot in South Carolina, and again, spoke mostly to college people, but also brought in indigenous faculty people to be on panels with me, as I had done in 1984. Got a few votes, got a little bit of publicity, but again, the inertia was overwhelming. In 2000, in my last year as a Democrat, I entered only the presidential caucuses in South Carolina. In one congressional district, the 2nd congressional district, I managed to get 7% of the caucus vote, which wasn't terrible. And I was actually leading Al Gore for the last national delegate, because he had 85, but he'd used 2020, 2020 There were 5 delegates, so for the 5th delegate, I was ahead 7. Molly Ivins loved it, and there is an article that I've got and things I hand out, and that is, that I had stood up to the system because even though I registered with the FEC, I intentionally violated several FEC rules on reporting. They wrote me nasty letters. I wrote nasty letters back. I challenged them to bring me to court. I wanted a test case. Well, they backed off. And, it's very sad. As soon as that election was over, I left the Democratic Party, never to return. I was a member of the United Citizens Party, which was a resuscitated African-American party that had put Ralph Nader up and so forth. So that's where it's been. Very shortly after that, I did move on to the Green Party. There wasn't a Green Party in those days in South Carolina. Moved on to the Green Party and then became a full-fledged Green really in the mid to late years of the first decade. Came to the Chicago Convention. I actually went to the Milwaukee Convention in 2004. I got some press credentials so I could get in, and I covered the convention. But anyway, that's where I am.
Let me ask you about that transition, because that's, I think, important to people.
Yeah.
What cumulatively, what caused you to move? Why the Green Party as opposed to just being an independent? At what point or why you felt there was no? Because there are a lot of people who feel that one should reform within the Democratic Party. So why not that, and why specifically the Green Party as opposed to anything else?
I came to the sad conclusion that the Democratic Party didn't want to be reformed. And that it was in the hands of the kinds of people, as I say, a lot of it were office holders who had been so compromised by interest groups, and also the party people and the campaign industry again. All these people had locked in on their niche. They were doing fine, thank you. We don't need to hear this smart-ass professor talk about how the country is going down the tubes. And that's essentially what it came down to. And I had some rather vigorous disagreements with some of them. But by the time the 2000 race was over, I said, that's it. And as I mentioned, there was no Green Party, but there was this wonderful United Citizens Party, which still exists. It's an African-American party largely. And I joined that. And there were some good people there. And I'm very proud. If anybody wants to look up on the web, the United Citizens Party, look down to the line for the year 2002, where I was the campaign manager for a fellow named Mark Whittington, who ran for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District, got over 10% of the vote, and we did it because we picketed the Bank of America national headquarters in Charlotte, made a video of it, ran it on 5 cable stations, because we knew, this is fall of 2002, that the predatory lending practices of the Bank of America, as well as the rest of the bank, were really going to hurt people. First of all, you were going to have foreclosures and all this kind of thing, but also that it was creating a bubble, and that bubble was going to burst. And if you'll go back and you'll see what we did and what the Democratic Party was doing, it was still taking money from the banks. It was still saying, oh, the banks are fine, there's no bubble, and everything's going to be all right. This was all in very stark contrast, and I was very proud because we took 10 South Carolinians, Mark and I, and a videographer and a bunch of other people, and went up to the corner of Trade and Tryon Street, which is the intersection in Charlotte for the Bank of America, and we picketed them. And I was very, very proud of it. So hopefully that answers your question. That is part of the transition. You find other people who were similarly disenchanted, and you say, okay, what are you going to do? And we felt that we could get some votes in that district. Once again, for president, in the caucus, I had gotten 7%, and I said, Mark, you got to do one thing. We only had $5,500. So you just got to do one spectacular thing. These banks are really doing nasty things to people. Let's get some people and go up to the Bank of America. And that's what we did. So that's pretty much it. And as I say, by 2008, certainly, I was a full-fledged Green. I was going to Green meetings 2006, 2007, and so forth, and became a full-fledged Green. Joined the Finance Committee in 2009, the Fundraising Committee in 2010. I've been on the National Committee for a long time. And I feel that this is a pretty good fit for me.
So, with that history, because you've clearly been politically and electorally active, and so taking us up to the present, what was part of your process of deciding to consider seeking the Green Party nomination, and what are you offering? What are your I don't want to say platform, because I think things are always more complex than a platform, but what's your message? What are you saying that you feel needs to be heard, given that there are other candidates? What makes your positions uniquely yours?
Mm-hmm. Well, I promised that I wouldn't get into high theory, because I don't think too many people want to hear about Kant and Hegel. But the fact is that there were kind of two tracks in my life. I would run for office, and then I would come back and write another book. The being away and the being campaigning really helped my perspective. It was amazing. It was kind of dialectical. And I would come back and, okay, well, no, something else. Here's another perspective. And as I say, I've written 9 books. I think that's probably it. But this last book, I think, I added a great deal to the theory. Some of it is a summary of some early work. But what it argued for was that there is a whole new paradigm coming. And I'll just be very brief here, but if you look at most of our politics historically, it's based on objective groups, workers who are living under owners, who are treating them unfairly, women who are being treated unfairly by men, black folks being treated unfairly by white folks, etc., etc. You can go through the whole list. It's based on what are simply called objective variables. In other words, it's not mind. Okay, the great dichotomy is object and mind, and you're not talking about mind. But what became clear to me is that there was a kind of transcendent variable, and what you'll see on the cover of my book, if you buy it, is a statement from one of the pre-publication reviewers who said, the necessary theoretical crossweave. Okay, look at my fingers here. I'm doing this. All right? All of the objective variables are vertical. Somebody's taking advantage of somebody else based on their objective status. The horizontal is now coming into play, which is, how do you perceive the world? And even more importantly, how do various institutions, like the American government, and I hope we have a little time to talk about the specifics of what's wrong with the government, see problems only in certain very narrow ways. In other words, the very perception, okay, is skewed. Not just the objective reality of how women are only paid 77% and how blacks are treated by the police and, all those things, but there's also the perception. And that has now got to be a full part of the political equation in this country. And I believe that very, very firmly. And so I've written this book. It has been selling. And I think that people will see, okay, there are new variables that have to be considered. And we've got to make sure, even before we started talking on camera here, you and I were talking about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had a personality problem. It wasn't his objective background. He was an intelligent fellow. He went to Duke Law School and so on. No, it was his personality. It was his perception of the world. And so too with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Feith and Front and, all of those kinds of people. There's a psychology here, and the psychology is something that we should be every bit as interested in as the objective background of these people. And so that's where I am. I mean, to answer your question, I came to a kind of coalescence that I think was ultimately dialectical, as I say. I think I achieved what I call the subatomic breakthrough. We're talking Niels Bohr here. For every objectivity, there's a subjectivity. In other words, you have objective characteristics. You're a white male of certain characteristics, but you also have a mind. Where are you on the range of being an authoritarian or an anti-authoritarian? Some of the early writings. On cognition, on thinking, do you incline toward apples and apples kind of reasoning or apples and oranges kind of reasoning? What about our government structurally? I argue that our government is very skewed because if you look at the centrifugal to centripetal spectrum, everybody understands those words. Obviously, we don't want to be like Kim Jong-un, North Korea, and Robert Mugabe and Zimbabwe and so forth. But you know where we are? We're at the other extreme. We're at the other extreme. We have the world's most centrifugal governmental structure. We have separation of powers, federalism, bicameralism, staggered elections, and something that I want to talk about, and that is separation of people. Because if you serve in one of the branches, you can't serve in the other. There's no bridge. So you don't get the coalescence of a majoritarian system. And this goes back to the founders. It goes back to Madison's number 10 Federalist. They did not want majoritarian, small d government. That's why they designed the system that they did. And I just think looking at it psychologically is one more dimension that helps you see it. But we have a system that is very, very skewed. Very skewed.
I'd almost say that one would say the system was designed to be atomized. Deliberately. Well, when you keep things in fragments, you avoid a whole. And I think that's part of the problem. So what? Not to be trite about it, but what would you do to fix it? It's a complex, particularly to get into government function.
That's a very fair question. As I say, some very capable people from the academy, but from the world of politics, came together very seriously in the mid-'80s. And what we gave to the president at that time and to the Congress were recommendations that would make our system somewhat closer to the parliamentary system. Not all the way, okay, but moving on that spectrum, doing certain things that would make us a little more coherent and permit cohesion of majoritarian groups. So, two specifics. One is the 4-year term for the House. This is an old idea. Lyndon Johnson said he agreed with it. Ronald Reagan said he agreed with it. The idea being that these midterm elections are very anti-majoritarian. A small number of people vote. It's a blocking vote. It negates what the people wanted when they voted in the regular cycle, the 4-year cycle. And look where you are. That is one of the strong recommendations that we made. And as I say, even Reagan said to Lloyd Cutler, "Yeah, I'll go along with that." The other thing that I think is really important is to get rid of that part of Section 6 of Article 1, which prohibits people who serve in the Congress from serving in the executive branch. We want bridges, and we wanted to be able to say, okay, at least some of the members of the cabinet, maybe the subcabinet, could come from the Congress, and that kind of cooperation would permit the government to be not only more cohesive, but more effective in forming winning majorities, so that the ideological perspective that won the election should have its policies carried out. We're a very anti-democratic country now, because it's clear what the people want and it's clear what the people vote for, but they don't get it. And poll after poll after poll on all of the principal issues shows our side to be pretty much at 50%, or in some cases well beyond. But we keep losing, and it's in the system. So those are two things that we felt very strongly about. We also wanted stronger parties, and smaller recommendations, like people who had been nominated for Congress in their party would be automatic delegates to the party convention. Okay, so they're in the room, and they're already melding. Okay, that's a smaller thing, but there were people who thought that was an important thing too. Obviously, we cannot talk about this without talking about campaign finance, the necessity for public funding. Clearly, the principal lever of people like the Koch brothers and so forth is money. And what's happened over the last years is just disgrace, but it was foreseeable. I wrote about it. Other people wrote about it. This is the path we were on. I'm not surprised. Let me show you a book. There was a book that I published in 2006. I don't know if you can see it. The 21st Century Left, Cognitions in the Constitution. Okay. What are the cognitive forms in the Constitution, and why Buckley is wrong. Buckley, as you know, was Buckley versus Vallejo, the 1976 case, which started the slippery slope. It was clear to me, and I think it was clear to other people who studied this seriously, that a case like Citizens United was very possible. It wasn't 100% certain, but that it was very, very possible. And what I tried to do here in a very legal way was point out that the Buckley case was really wrong, and that that case needed to be overturned. Well, of course, what happened is 4 years later, Citizens United, it wasn't overturned, it was made worse, it was accelerated.
So, given that, because one of the problems you point towards, in fact, if you're a TV person and have watched House of Cards, beyond the obvious politics parts of the characters, there's actually a tension between in some of the episodes about cabinet appointments and taking them from Congress. Obviously, they have to, as you pointed to before, if you're in Congress, you can't serve in the cabinet. And there's a lot of strategic discussion of whether not only is that person suited for, whether that person is suited for a cabinet position, but if they are, it then impacts their position in Congress, especially if they're not just Congress people, but they may be committee chairs or they may be party whips,
Right.
and it's extremely disruptive because it highlights the fracture that happens when one can only be an either or. And in your mentioning of this, you also mentioned the strengthening of parties, and I think that's I want to hear what your concept of that is, because I often hear amongst activists and nominal progressives, they feel we should get rid of parties, and I kind of feel that's kind of, one could argue it's unconstitutional, but also unnatural, because to do that, and we talk about atomization, people do best when they act collectively, and to me that's what a party is.
If you got rid of parties, what would you have as your aggregative institution? Some other aggregative institution would have to come along. Yeah, I agree completely. There are people who think that the best way to solve a problem is to get rid of the institution that's causing the problem. And it's kind of like, if your roof leaks, the best way to solve it is to get rid of your roof. Okay, I mean, if you have a leaky roof, get rid of that roof. Okay, get up there and tear it off, and then enjoy the next rainstorm. Right? I mean, there's that sort of thinking going on. My favorite is these people who every once in a while just regale me with how the one golden solution is term limits. If we just had term limits, this whole thing would be so, well, nonsense. And I have a response, and it's the first time I've said it in a public way. But here's what you say to those people. Say you agree completely. When you think that all of these corporate charters that are sitting in a file drawer down in Wilmington, Delaware, should have a time limit on them. Because if you can't do anything to get at Jamie Dinian and Maurice Blankfein and Ken, whatever his name was, Ken Lewis at Bank of America, who we picketed, the one thing you might do is put a term limit on the private sector. Oh, well, I've told that to a couple of people, and their jaw just drops. What do you mean? No, I'm talking about congressmen. I said, I know you're talking about congressmen. I'm talking about corporations. What if we had term limits for corporations so that these guys would not be able to have a permanent corporate veil? And before the statute of limitations ran out, that corporation would not have its charter renewed, and you could deal with these crooks, and they are. I mean, it's amazing that nobody went to jail. I mean, it's been said 100 times, but it's still just as true. When you look at us compared to, say, Iceland and other places, I mean, it's just unbelievable that these guys could sit there in front of the Senate and just smile and snicker and so forth, because they knew with corporate veil that they weren't going to jail.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're challenging a lot of what I would consider the conventional thinking, even amongst those who are self-described as left or progressive, and there's a lot of innovative thought not happening in political circles when we look at problems and how they might be solved.
Let me say something more about this, Greg. The Green Party itself, even though I'm very fond of it and a fervent supporter, suffers from a serious contradiction. And that contradiction is that we are still, to some extent, a child of the late 60s and the early 70s. I am all in favor of the kind of grassroots democracy that all Greens take very seriously. But that by itself doesn't do it, because you need to have something that is strong enough in the public sector to stand up to the banks and Wall Street and the oil companies and the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies, and you know the long list as well as I do. And the fact of the matter is that there's something kind of residual in the Green Party, something in the gene pool there that says, well, we really don't want a strong government. Really? So you want a weak government? Well, guess what? You have a weak government. Just read today's paper, and you'll see how the government lost one more time to the insurance company. Scott McClarty wrote a wonderful piece on the real problem with the Affordable Care Act, and it's in my book. It's that the insurance companies eventually will work their way to having tremendous increases in their fees, and they're going to do it through mergers and acquisitions. It's already happened. Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Humana, I mean, you name them, they are already mega corporations. They're only going to get bigger. And you're going to have huge oligopolies. And, the Green Party's current position is not strong enough in the sense of we need a strong public sector. Mm-hmm. And if you go back and look at the women's parties and the labor parties and Teddy Roosevelt and antitrust and Woodrow Wilson and so forth, none of them argued for a decentralized federal government. That's the one thing that I disagree with in our 10 key values. I believe in decentralization at lower levels of government, but we already have the world's most decentralized government, and it's why we're losing. So, if anything, we should be slightly re-centralizing.
It's funny that you brought up ACA, because what you're describing is almost what I would call an inversion of single payer, in which the government is so weak that the single is the monopolistic or at least oligarchic insurance companies. There'll be a single payer of sorts that will be the private sector insurance companies, because the public will be so weak.
But, it shouldn't surprise us, because that's what they wanted all along. They wanted privatization. And they want privatization in everything. They're getting it in the prison system. My God, what a travesty that is. And the people who are being terribly mistreated in these private prisons. And the audacity of some of these corporations suing the states when they don't get enough bodies. I mean, this is just unbelievable. But, that's what the other side wants. And, once again, to go back to my theory, it's a private sector, not simply because of money, although that's an awfully large part of it, but it's also because the private sector likes the cognitive form of the naked bilateral contract. And if I have a powerful position and you do not have a powerful position, such as between an employer and an employee for Walmart, then I don't want anything other than a naked contract which permits me to bargain with you. And if you want more money than I want to give you, thank you. I'll talk to the next person. And that's been the way the game was played. And supposedly, antitrust law, that's another reason that I left the Democratic Party, because Clinton virtually shut down the antitrust division of the Justice Department. It was only in the very final year when the computer owners of America raised bloody hell about what Microsoft and Bill Gates were doing to Netscape, that there was finally a halfway reasonable prosecution. But there just wasn't any antitrust enforcement, and I'm sorry, the Obama administration hasn't done much.
Well, let me ask you. This might seem tangential, but it's not, because I think there's a subtext underlying in that the psychology of the voter, and why are people electing these people and parties that are doing this?
What the Republicans did that was very clever was to interject a cultural, a psychologically motivated issue, which they put on so many ballots, and even up at the level of of the presidential candidates. There's an awful lot of talk about, well, I mean, Trump is the worst, of course, but, what happens when the Mexican immigrants come through, come through our porous borders and so forth. Those kinds of issues are basically psychological issues, and those are issues where people are willing to vote against their economic interest. So you have Bernie Sanders saying, why are these people voting against economic interest? Let me tell you, when I was running for president in 1984, I was walking up in his city, Burlington, Vermont, and I was going over to a university that had a flag. It's kind of funny. It had 3 letters, UVM, Universitaire Verte Montagne. You know that? It's not the University of Vermont. You're only 94 miles from Montreal. So I thought, well, as a courtesy, I will go in and introduce myself to the mayor. Well, just as I was going up to City Hall, the mayor popped out the front door. This is Burlington. And I started to talk politics with him, and I said, there's a psychological variable in all of this. And the mayor said, no, it's all economic, 100%. That's the only way to understand this. Well, that's the same man who's running for president, as the alternative candidate. And in his own way, of course, he's right about the economics, but then so is everybody else. I mean, he's not saying anything that you can't read out of the statistical abstract that comes out from the government. But to see it in a more broad and what I believe is a more powerful intellectual paradigm, Bernie's not up to it.
Because that relates to a question someone had asked in the chat about your views of Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Because there's a perception that you have your 2 options there if you're nominally left, progressive, liberal as this society defines it, which is not necessarily the same in any other country. It's actually centrist to conservative. But there's a perception that somehow Sanders is a solution, and then there are those that think of themselves as practical, that somehow Sanders is not practical, that Hillary Clinton is the practical solution, and yet from a Green perspective there's a problem with their approach and the party that they belong to. So I'm going to ask rather broadly, since you brought up a critique of Sanders, but include Clinton in that. Yet there seems to be some adoration of her. I mean, she's certainly leading in the polls in the Democratic Party, and the early polls actually have her leading most Republicans. But where does that come from, and why? When it's so clear that she represents a certain economic interest, has and has been quite visible, open about it.
Well, she's very much in bed with the Wall Street people, and you see where her money comes from. But what you have with her is, of course, and I don't like to be critical of women, they have a very well-reasoned argument for why it's time for a woman president. And I might be willing to go along, but not this one. Maybe Professor Warren. Professor Warren was kind enough to cite my book on the middle class and her book on the middle class 3 times, in fact. If she could be persuaded to become a Green, maybe I could support her. Although her position on Israel is very unacceptable. I think maybe she thinks she can only fight the battle. But, to answer your question, I mean, Hillary stands for something for an awful lot of people who are willing to look the other way when it comes to where her money comes from.
Yes, and it kind of brings us to the current state of politics of that the candidates almost sort of represent sort of a cross between caricatures and icons or archetypes rather than actual policy analysis, because Hillary strikes an emotional chord in some people, Sanders does with another group of people, and yet there's a third set of people who, depending on where they fall on different lines, are attracted to one or the other Republican candidates, and yet of the three sets, I would say, or more actually, within those two parties, there's a certain immutable thing that won't change anything about the system, because people don't see beyond the symbols they represent, versus a very different kind of thinking that the Green Party represents, and then you presented the kind of the sort of a paradox within the Green Party about decentralization and government versus corporate structure. But what would you have to say in terms of presenting your, if you were to give your, what they always describe as the elevator pitch, if you had just a couple of minutes to describe to the public what makes you and the Green Party different? Why aren't you running the Democratic primary, since you've done it before? I mean, besides the fact that you're not happy with the Democratic Party, I mean, what philosophically brings you to a different set of positions?
Okay. It's 2 minutes, right?
Yeah, that's a challenge, because that's you'll get, as Ralph Nader said, we've gone from the sound bite to the sound bar. So
let me start at the top, because there is a pyramid of knowledge, and again, I'm not going to get terribly esoteric here, but at the first level, at the top, you need people who are willing to think in a variety of cognitive forms. It's not just being open-minded in some substantive sense, but it's a whole pattern of thinkers, of thinking. Let's remember something. This government is overwhelmingly dominated by people who have English common law educations. This is something that isn't talked about very much, but it's really true. And they have very, very analytic minds, linear, deductive. So if you listen to Hillary, I mean, she's a very smart woman. I mean, there's an IQ there, but it's a very linear way of thinking. It's very compartmentalized. So there's nobody here like, say, Václav Havel, all right, or Nelson Mandela. Those kinds of people don't get into politics. The last person of an artistic temperament we had was Eugene McCarthy, and you see how the Democratic Party treated him. He was looked upon as a three-headed freak, and it was just an awful thing. And they don't like those kinds of people. This expression, our way of thinking, that expression? Come around to our way of thinking. Think of that expression in a very literal sense. What is the structure of their thought? Okay? So that's at the top. That's the theory. And then you come down to the structure. Well, if you look at what most of the founders did, what profession were they? Oh, well, there were some non-lawyers, but by far the largest clump of those people were English common law lawyers. And they really felt that a great deal of the business of our country could be done in the private sector, okay? And that even the business in the public sector could be done in a lawyer-like manner, okay? Transactional, okay? Contractual. It didn't need as we talked about 15, 20 minutes ago, it didn't need any public aggregation. So, theory, structure. Then the third level is the various substantive issues, and we don't need to talk about them in great measure. But you can look at all these kinds of things: healthcare, labor, infrastructure, antitrust, consumer protection, tax. In every one of those areas that I was prepared to say, one or two sentences about, the bad guys won. And the way to think about it was analytic, passed through a structure that was analytic. And if those terms bother you, just think of, again, apples and apples versus apples and oranges. Our system only does apples and apples. It doesn't do apples and oranges. So, that's where you are. And then you come to the Green Party. And as I say, I firmly believe in the 4 pillars, and I believe in about 9 3/4 of the key values. I really believe that when it comes to the federal government, the principle of decentralization is wrong. We are already more decentralized than we should be.
So let me ask you programmatically, what would you do to properly centralize it without it becoming top down? Because I think that would be the challenge, or at least in green thinking. What would you do?
For whatever small contribution I have made, I have run in, this is now my 5th campaign. I've gotten some publicity from the press. There's an occasional reporter who finds this interesting. But I think even more importantly, I have written 9 books. And people read these, and I think slowly we're coming to understand the psychological variable. We're understanding how skewed our system is. It's skewed theoretically. It's skewed. Notice it's up there. That was good, wasn't it? Yeah. It's skewed in its structure and process. And then on so many individual issues, it comes down to what kind of deal can the K Street folks make with the committee chairs and with what Ted Lowy called the access points. Back in 1969, Ted Lowy wrote The End of Liberalism. And Lowy was a very bright guy. I think he foresaw some of this too. And as some of the old-timers in the Green Party will remember, he was on Ralph Nader's steering committee in 2000, the chair professor, Cornell University, very, very bright guy, who saw that the liberal order was being prostituted. Access points, captive agencies, the revolving door, all of this kind of thing, where the very line between private and public is so blurred that there's really no way that the public sector is going to be able to stand up for itself. And that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now to go off on a completely different tangent, and maybe a much lighter question that I see posted in the chat room. One of the things people think about the Green Party is how we are perceived, including how we ourselves perceive ourselves. So the question somebody asked is what are your positive impressions? Well, I think that it's leading to say that they were positive, but what are your positive impressions of the Green Party presidential forum with the candidates? What was your sense of what the Green Party is offering, the personalities involved? And you may not want to get individual in terms of your comments, but it's up to you. But do you get a sense where... do you get a feeling about it? I don't want to lead you. Do you get a feeling about the people involved and what the public sense of us would be seeing this? Dare you go there?
I think that the presidential forum was good because it had some some breadth. In other words, there were several people who said to me, "Oh, there was a good range of perspectives." It was also good because we were very polite to each other. No one was trying to put anybody down. We just each gave our views. On the other hand, to be honest, it wasn't terribly deep. Okay.
It was a forum.
Yeah, it was a forum. They didn't begin to get, and of course I didn't have the time. No one had the time. You had an hour and a half, and you had the introductions and so forth, and you had 5 people, and you get 3 minutes to make an introductory statement, answer some questions, and 3 minutes at the end. I mean, please, that's just not going to cut it. Now that doesn't mean we shouldn't do that, but it also means that we ought to have other venues where we discuss things in greater depth, which is one of the reasons I'm very grateful to you, because I think we've touched on some things here this evening that have some depth. At least I hope so.
Yeah, my sense of the forum and what it offers, because I do think there's a public perception of the Green Party and of alternative parties in general, that they're monoliths. And although in a forum like that you're not going to get depth, I do think there was a presentation of breadth. That the Green Party is a range.
Yeah.
There's a common ground, but there's some very diverse thinking and very diverse personality types who are involved. I found that it was important because given this election cycle, people, as we've been talking about, people have been gravitating towards a certain campaign in a mainstream party, and I think that when people choose their party affiliation and where they're going to vote, that there's going to be a breadth of candidates in the Green Party. It's funny because you're seeing something like that in the Republican Party, where as time goes on, it looks like every single state in the union will have a Republican candidate running for president of every flavor of Republican thinking. But I think there's almost a perception that and it hasn't. The Republican is a broad range of what. Coming from a certain perspective, that some would say, broad range of the silly and very silly party. If you've ever watched Monty Python, then there's the Democratic Party, which always seems to push into a person each year, and there are others. And there's always the front runner, and the Green Party. Although that could technically be possible, I think it's important for people to see the Green Party as having breadth, having a range, and I think that has been a challenge for the party in its early presidential elections, because it was Ralph Nader. It was the person, much like there's the person in the Democratic Party, depending on your thinking. And even though in 2000 we had a 4-way primary, although it was hard for the public to the media, to the extent we got attention, to pull away from the gravitational force of a single person. And I think we're seeing something different this time, because even though Greens might perceive one candidate as a front runner, as far as the major public is concerned, the large media, there's actually several people who have had media presence of different forms. And I don't want to go to individuals, but I would say several of the candidates have outside of the life of the Green Party, gotten press coverage in their political in activist circles. So I think we're seeing something a bit different this time, and I'm hoping
Yeah.
that
I hope that's true. I agree with you on breadth. I wish we had a little more depth. I don't want to stop this, but there may be some people who fall off after an hour. And let me
yeah.
say this. My email address is very simple. Bill Kreml, all one word, no dot, no space. Okay, just BILLKREML at gmail.com. What I'm willing to do is to travel. I've already had a couple states ask me to come, or to do things by Skype at fundraisers, your state convention, anything for individual candidates. Please contact me and ask me, because I have set aside this year, really from now to the next national convention, to work hard to get my ideas out, listening to other people's ideas. But at least I think I can say, look, I've been in the academy 50 years. I worked very hard on an original political philosophy. I was a visiting professor twice at the University of Peking. I was taken to Moscow to meet with Gorbachev. I've lectured at the Woodrow Wilson Center at Princeton. I think I have something to say, and if you think I can help you, fine. And I'm not trying to sell the book. It's a niche book. Theory books never sell. But if you want to copy the book, I can make my $1.50 or whatever it is. But I'm available. That's what I'm saying. Bill Kreml at gmail.com.
Thank you, Bill, for spending your evening with us. And what I would like to do in the future, going forward, as we cycle through our presidential candidates, because this type of show gives the candidates the opportunity to go much deeper into certain things. And I do hope
Absolutely. And I'm very grateful to you that we had that opportunity.
And I do think that we will be doing additional shows throughout the election cycle with the individual candidates again. And what I would like to see, and I can see questions coming up in the chat, also in the text chat, is that we were covering specific ranges of issues, maybe foreign affairs and military, for an hour, and then maybe economics for another, and
sure.
Some of what you went into the structural reform, although some Greens hate to use the word reform. It sounds so tepid, but structural change in government. So I don't think this is, I should say, speaking positively, I do think this is just the beginning of greater in-depth opportunities for the candidates, and this is something we haven't done before. So we'll be looking forward to having you on again, and
I'm available.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much, Greg. This has really been the.
And thank you, Bill. Have a good night, and see you online. Thanks. Thank you. Hi, that was Bill Kreml, who is one of currently 5 candidates who are either exploring or have announced seeking the Green Party nomination for president. For those not familiar with the Green Party, we are a political party, and we are not a monolith. There is a grassroots decision-making process, and we are already on the ballot now at 22 states and counting. And according to those state laws, just like the other political parties, by state law, we hold primaries, caucuses, and or state delegated conventions to select our nominee. And that means if you're a Green or interested in becoming a Green, there will be a process for you to participate in, because I know people tend to be looking at, well, I'm maintaining a registration or involvement in another party because I want to vote in their caucus primary. Well, there's motive to do that in the Green Party, because as you've seen in our interview so far, and ones we've done already, and there will be more coming up, there will be a range of candidates, and it will be up to you as part of our grassroots decision-making process. And I will say one thing that differentiates us from, let's say, the Democratic Party, for example, we don't have any party leadership appointed superdelegates. It's really all up to you. You get to decide on your local and state level, and that's part of the kind of grassroots empowerment. And you don't see that in the two titanic parties. There is top-down decision-making in both cases, in both major parties. That doesn't exist. So, sometimes when people talk about the Green Party, it's how do our laundry lists differ from other parties? And particularly, why aren't you in some other party doing the same thing? Why are you the Green Party? Well, one very, very fundamental difference is our view towards structure. What it is to be involved in grassroots decision making. And we do tend to be decentralized in that we are anti-authoritarian. Maybe that's a better way to put it, because as Kreml pointed out, there are some interesting approaches about decentralization where it does work and where possibly collective power, centralized power, may be called for when combating the centralization of corporations. But what we are is, in doing all this, anti-authoritarian and very much designed to empower the grassroots. So with that, I'll say goodnight.